Pressure doesn't break things. Give does. Ren Okafor's father used to say that, back when she was young enough to think it was just something father said. She thought of it now with 2 fingers pressed against a strain gauge bolted into the rib of Kesavar Relay, a station that groaned quietly, always, like something breathing in its sleep. She was still turning the phrase over when the deck shuddered under her boots. It wasn't large. A shudder through the plating, gone in under 2 seconds, the kind of thing the station's dampeners should have swallowed before anyone felt it at all. But Ren felt it, and so did the gauge under her hand, which had held a patient, unremarkable reading for the entire shift and now, for 1 heartbeat, didn't. "You're doing the finger thing again," said Bran Lindqvist, ducking into the maintenance spine behind her with a tool bag over one shoulder and a scanner already chirping half a beat too late. "Gage talk to you?" "Something did." She kept her hand where it was. "You feel that?" "Felt it in my teeth." He kept his calm without waiting to be asked. "Ops Lindqvist. Structural event, spine 4, near the throat monitoring array. Anyone logging that?" The reply came back clipped and unbothered, and the careful cadence Ilvanar's speech always carried through a translator. "Confirmed, minor harmonic event, source unclear. Sensors show nominal recovery. No action required." Kesavar Relay existed for exactly this kind of event, in theory. It sat in high orbit near a wound in space called the Onev throat, a slow collapsing anomaly that vented radiation on its own unpredictable schedule. The station caught what it vented, measured it, and bled it off before it reached anywhere that mattered. The Ilvanar had built the relay 2 centuries before humans had ships that could reach it. Later, they decided humans made useful hands for a posting nobody senior particularly wanted. 6 of them now, folded into a crew of just over 200, doing the parts of the work that meant touching things directly. Ren looked back at her gauge. It had settled to its usual reading, giving nothing away. But her palm was still resting against the metal, and something under it hadn't quite finished settling. A faint residual hum the readout wasn't showing at all. "Give does what pressure can't," she murmured mostly to herself. "What?" "Nothing. Just my dad." She pulled her hand back and made a note in her own log, not the official one, the kind of private, running observation she'd kept the habit of long before Kesavar Relay, because it was usually nothing, and she liked knowing firsthand when it wasn't. "Something's talking to the hull that the sensors aren't hearing yet." Bran didn't argue with her. In 3 years working beside her, he'd learned that Ren's private notes were right more often than not, and that she rarely mentioned them unless they were worth mentioning. He'd learned it the way you learn most things about a person you trust with your life on a rotation like this, slowly, through repetition, until it stopped being a guess and became simply a fact you built your own habits around. "Flag it up the chain? Watch it for a shift first. If I bring Terrell a hunch with no numbers behind it, he'll file it under human intuition and move on." She said it without much heat. It was simply true, the way most things about their standing on the relay were true. Humans were new here, and by the numbers every Ilvanar report ran, statistically fragile, short lives, fast decisions, prone according to old survey data to panic under pressure that a longer-lived species metabolized calmly. Nobody said it unkindly. It was just how the station's risk models had been built, and nothing had yet given anyone a reason to rebuild them. They finished the shift without further incident. The gauge held steady. Ren made her way toward crew quarters afterward through corridors humming with the ordinary sounds of an ordinary day, trade chatter drifting from the mess, laughter rolling down from an Ilvanar recreation deck 2 levels up. She passed Bren in the mess on the way, elbow deep in a ration pack that had clearly lost an argument with the reheater. He held up the mangled foil pouch without a word, a silent offering, and she took half of it anyway because turning down bad food together was one of the small rituals that made a posting like this survivable. They didn't talk about the tremor again. There wasn't anything new to say about it yet, and some things were better left to settle overnight, the way a good well needed time before you trusted it. She stopped by the observation bay before turning in, the way she often did, and looked out at the throat itself, a smear of wrongness against the starfield, not quite visible so much as sensed, like a breath the universe hadn't let out yet. Her gauge had read nominal the entire walk over. The hum under her palm hadn't come back. She thought about calling her father, out of habit more than need, before remembering the light lag would turn any conversation into two people talking past each other by 9 minutes. She sent a message instead, short and unremarkable, the kind she sent every few days whether or not anything had happened worth reporting. Then she logged the tremor in her private file, and went to bed. By the 4th day, Wren's private log held 4 entries instead of 1, each event slightly stronger than the last, each one waved off by Ops in the same clipped, unbothered tone. None of them were large enough on their own to trip a structural alert. All 4 together were starting to look, to her, like the opening bars of something the station's model hadn't been built to notice. Terrell V found her in the observation bay, staring at data on a slate instead of at the stars. Terrell was senior enough to have opinions about who belonged where on Kesevar Relay, and young enough by Ilvanar standards, 90 years into an expected lifespan north of 400, to still enjoy sharing them. He wasn't unkind. He was simply certain, in the way of a species that had never needed to be wrong quickly. "You're rerunning the harmonic logs again," he said, in the tone of someone noting a minor eccentricity. "Ops classified them as noise days ago." "Ops classified them as noise because the model says noise is the likeliest explanation. That's not the same as confirming it." He folded his hands behind him, unhurried. "You have 4 days of engineering experience with this specific anomaly, Okafor. The model has 2 centuries. The model also logs harmonic drift under environmental telemetry, not structural alerts. Nobody's watching these the way I've been watching them." She held up the slate. 4 events. Each one stronger. That's a pattern, not noise. Perhaps. He studied the slate a moment longer than the argument strictly required. "I would also point out that Lindqvist's manual override rig for the coupling array is, by station protocol, unauthorized. If your instinct about this trend is correct, an unapproved patch job attached to it does this facility no favors. It works. It has not been tested against a real structural event. There's a difference between working in theory and working when it matters." He wasn't hostile about it, closer to genuine concern, filtered through 2 centuries of institutional caution. "I've seen improvisation cost more than it saved, more times than either of you have been alive, Okafor." A recreation deck alarm sounded somewhere above them, brief and unrelated, and both of them glanced up out of pure reflex before it cut off. Terrell's expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders eased half a degree, the small tell of someone who'd been more on edge than his voice let on. "Or we've just learned not to wait for permission before something goes wrong," Ren said, keeping her voice even. "Different survival strategy. Doesn't make it worse." "That depends entirely on what it costs you when it fails," Terrell said. "I'm not questioning Lindqvist's competence. I'm questioning whether this station can afford to find out where his competence ends during an actual emergency, rather than during a supply shortfall with nothing at stake." "Then let's hope it never has to," Ren said. "I'm not asking you to authorize it," Ren said. "I'm asking you to remember it exists, if the trend I'm flagging turns out to be real." Terrell didn't answer that directly. He tapped the slate once, considering, and for a moment she thought he might actually ask to see the raw data himself. Instead he handed it back and said, in the driest tone she'd heard from him yet, that he hoped for both their sakes she was wrong, because being right would mean rewriting a great deal of paperwork neither of them wanted to do. It wasn't quite a joke. It was close enough to one that she let herself smile on the walk back to the machine deck. She found Bren afterward in his cramped workshop off the machine deck, elbow deep in the rig's housing, humming something off-key. "4th event logged an hour ago," she said. "Same pattern, stronger. It's not noise, Bren." He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag that had given up being cleaned months earlier. Somewhere behind him the coupling housing let out a small, protesting hiss, and he thumped it once with the flat of his hand out of pure reflex, the way you'd settle a stubborn animal rather than a piece of machinery. "You want to take it to Sayana directly?" Sayana runs everything through actuarial review before it becomes an action. 4 soft data points and a feeling buys us another week of nothing. She rubbed her eyes. I want the rig staged near the coupling array. Charged. Just in case the model's wrong before anyone official agrees it's wrong. He studied her for a moment, the easy humor fading into something steadier. He'd seen that particular focus in her only a handful of times, and it had always meant she noticed something worth trusting. Staged and charged, he said. I'll log it as routine maintenance so Terrell doesn't have another reason to lecture either of us. That night, the fifth harmonic event hit hard enough that nobody on the station needed a private log to notice it. The alarm that woke Rin wasn't the drill klaxon. It was sharper, staggered, the tone reserved for hull integrity failure, and it had her out of her bunk and into her boots before her mind caught up with her body. All crew brace stations, the station voice repeated in 3 languages. Structural event confirmed, Sector 9. This is not a drill. Sector 9 sat directly along the coupling array Bren had spent 2 months rigging a bypass for, the same array Ren had been logging drift against for 4 straight days. Nobody had told Miran to stay clear of it. Nobody had known to. Ren was already moving. She reached the machine deck as Bren came sprinting from the opposite corridor, rig case slung across his back, face pale under the emergency lighting. Coupling array took a direct harmonic surge, he said, breathless. Pressure spiking in the access corridor behind it. Ops confirms 1 crew member trapped. Miran due. 12 meters in, breach spreading behind her. They reached the junction to find Seanadun already there, calm in the particular way of someone running numbers faster than the crisis was unfolding, flanked by 2 junior officers and a wall of status readouts, casting the whole corridor in a cold amber light. Administrator. What's the rescue plan? There isn't one that meets threshold. Sayana didn't look away from the readouts. Where Terrell's certainty came wrapped in qualifiers, hers came flat, unhedged, offered as simple fact rather than argument. That corridor shares its primary conduit with life support for 2 adjoining sectors. Unsealed, the fault cascades past Sector 9 within minutes. Protocol seals it now. That is the calculation. Seal it, and Miran dies in there. I'm aware of the cost, Okafor. I have made this calculation before, on other postings, with other names attached to it. It does not become easier. It remains correct. Ren looked past her to the readout, a corridor filling slowly with vented atmosphere, 1 trapped figure marked in amber, a survival curve dropping in a smooth, patient line that assumed nobody was coming. Your model assumes a standard rescue. Suited team, full protocol, formal approval chain. Ren nodded toward Bren's rig case. That's not what I'm proposing. His bypass vents the differential from this side without waiting on the automated approval sequence. Untested against a live surge. Also faster than anything else on the table, and it only needs 2 people willing to go in alone. Unauthorized equipment. Unapproved procedure. You're asking me to weigh 2 centuries of established practice against a rig Lindqvist built out of spare housings during a supply shortfall. I'm asking you to weigh a survival probability of 0 against one nobody's actually calculated yet, because nobody's tried. That is not how risk management works, Okafor. No, Ren said. It's how people work, when the alternative is watching someone die where they could still be reached. A chance, instead of a guarantee there isn't one. Terrell arrived mid-argument, out of breath from a dead run. He took in the readouts, the amber figure, the 2 humans already gearing up. Administrator, the harmonic pattern Okafor flagged 4 days ago matches this event's signature almost exactly. I had the chance to weigh that and didn't. I'd ask you to weigh it now. Sayana's silence stretched long enough that Ren understood the decision could still go against them. 6 minutes before I seal this sector regardless of outcome, Sayana said finally. Go. They went. The corridor beyond the hatch was noise and haze, pressure alarms screaming, atmosphere venting through a fracture running the length of the ceiling. The air had a taste to it now, metallic and thin, the kind that made every breath feel slightly stolen. Ren found Miran pressed against the support strut 12 meters in, young for an Ilvanar, eyes wide with a fear that translated across species without needing any device to explain it. One of her hands was wrapped tight around a length of conduit as if letting go of it might be the thing that finally decided everything. "Stay against the wall," Ren shouted, already unpacking the rig. "We're equalizing the pressure by hand. It'll feel wrong before it feels right." "You are not a certified rescue technician," Miran managed, voice thin under the noise, somewhere between accusation and disbelief. "No," Ren agreed, already seating the first coupling. "I'm the one who's here." Somewhere above them the fracture widened another few centimeters with a sound like a knuckle cracking, and Miran flinched hard enough to lose her grip on the conduit for a fraction of a second before catching it again, knuckles pale, eyes fixed on Ren's hands rather than on the ceiling, as if watching the work itself might be enough to keep it from stopping. Bren fed the bypass into the primary coupling, hands steady despite everything shaking around him. It sparked once, caught, and the venting node dropped half a tone. Then the ceiling fracture widened, and the corridor's structural readout fell apart at once. "Secondary failure," Bren called, voice cracking with effort. "Whole support run's going, not just the coupling. This alone won't hold it." Ren looked at Miran, then at the failing ceiling, then at the minutes ticking down toward a hatch neither of them would be on the right side of if they didn't move faster. Give does what pressure can't, she thought, and went for the second coupling herself. "Tyrell," Ren shouted into her comm, bracing the second rig against a strut that groaned under her weight. "I need a live structural feed, not the model's projection. What's actually happening above us?" A pause, just long enough to be frightening. Then Tyrell's voice came back, steadier than she expected. "Reading it directly off the array now. Fractures propagating along strut 6, feeding the differential faster than one bypass can compensate. Brace a countervent at strut 4 and you might slow it enough to hold until the automated reroute catches up." "Might. I don't have a model that's run this configuration before, Okafor. I'm telling you what I believe, not what I can prove. That's not a comfortable thing for me to say. It's the only kind of truth that's ever gotten anything done fast enough to matter." She moved. Bren held the primary coupling while Ren fought her way through the haze to strut 4. The second bypass caught harder than the first, resisting for one long second before the venting node dropped again, and this time held. "Differential stabilizing," Tyrell reported, disbelief plain even through the translator. "Fracture rates slowing. Whatever you just did, it's working." It held long enough for the automated reroute to finally take the strain off both struts at once. The alarm dropped from a scream to a low, tired groan, and then to something almost like quiet. Ren pulled Miran free and half-carried her toward the hatch, Bren at her other side, both of them soaked through and shaking now that there was room to shake. Seanu was waiting on the far side when it cycled open, inside the 6 minutes and not a second to spare. Nobody spoke for a moment. Miran sat against the corridor wall, breathing hard, alive in a way the amber curve had said she wouldn't be. Bren dropped down beside her, favoring one arm he'd wrenched bracing the second rig, and said nothing about it until the station medic arrived and made him say something about it. Even then, all he offered was that it had been worth it, which was as close as he ever came to admitting anything hurt. "That was, for the record," Miran said, still catching her breath, "an extremely unauthorized rescue." "Extremely," Ren agreed. "I would like it on my record that I did not ask for it." "Noted," Ren said, and something in Miran's expression, exhausted as it was, came close to a smile. "That should not have worked," Seanu said eventually, something loosening beneath her careful precision that hadn't been there before the alarm sounded. "Your model assumed a standard team on a standard timeline," Ren said, still catching her breath. "It didn't account for 2 people willing to keep going past where your protocol says to stop." Seanu looked at her for a long moment, and didn't try to explain it any further than that. She simply nodded, once, the way someone does when a number they've trusted for a long time has just been quietly, permanently revised. It was not, she added afterward, an argument for lowering the threshold generally. The next corridor might not bend the way this one had, and she would seal it again without hesitation if the odds came back the same. Wren didn't push her on that. She understood, better than most people could have, the difference between being grateful something worked and being convinced it always would. Tyrell knelt briefly beside Miran before straightening to face Wren. I owe you an apology. I dismissed your instinct 4 days ago because it didn't match 2 centuries of accumulated data. Tonight it outran that data by several critical minutes. He glanced toward Miran, something heavier crossing his expression. Her rotation was scheduled before your first log entry ever existed, and the drift itself was filed under environmental telemetry the entire time. It never once crossed into the structural alerts her own checklist would have flagged. That is an institutional failure, not chance, and it is mine to answer for as much as anyone's. I don't know how to account for any of it in the models I currently use. I intend to learn. You don't need to account for it, Wren said. Just remember it's possible, next time the numbers say something isn't. The formal review took the better part of a week, longer than the rescue itself had taken from first alarm to last. Ilvanar institutions moved carefully even when praising something, weighing every implication before committing it to record, and then spent most of that week answering the same handful of questions phrased 4 different ways by 4 different panel members, none of whom seemed to trust that the answer could really be as simple as it sounded. When the findings finally came through, they carried more caution than triumph. Bren's rig was authorized as a secondary option aboard Kesevar Relay specifically, pending enough field data for the wider Ilvanar network to consider it elsewhere, and Wren was offered a provisional seat on the station's structural review board. Provisional, Seana noted dryly. For exactly as long as it took 2 centuries of committee habit to decide 4 days of instinct could be trusted twice. Bren's arm healed the way most things on Kesevar Relay healed, slowly, without ceremony, accompanied by a great deal of complaining he clearly enjoyed doing. Wren stood in the observation bay a few days later, 2 fingers resting against the replacement gauge freshly bolted into the rebuilt spine, watching the throat breathe its slow, familiar pattern against the stars. Miran found her there, moving a little stiffly still, and stood beside her without saying anything for a while. Tyrell told me what you said. In the corridor. About pressure and give. My father was a structural engineer. Bridges, mostly. Wren kept her fingers on the gauge, feeling nothing but a steady, ordinary hum. Things built to bend a little instead of holding perfectly rigid, because rigid is what breaks first. And the corridor. The rig. That was also this. That was also this. Miran considered that, and didn't try to sum it up any further than the silence already had. She simply stood beside Wren and watched the throat breathe with her, the 2 of them quiet in a way that hadn't been possible between their species a week earlier. Behind them, faintly, Wren could hear Bren arguing good-naturedly over the workshop comm about whether the rig deserved a proper name now that it had an official file number, and Tyrell's dry voice cutting in underneath it, unconvinced that a piece of unauthorized hardware needed a name at all. Wren's hand stayed on the gauge a while longer, steady under her palm, saying nothing that needed translating. Outside the viewport, the throat kept breathing, the way it always had and always would, patient enough to outlast every model built to explain it.